The candle flame wavered as John Murphy's wife touched his shoulder in the darkness. 4:30 in the morning, January 1872. Cold enough that frost had painted ferns on the inside of their tenement window. He could hear his children breathing in the next room, 3 small bodies sharing one mattress. He sat up slowly, careful not to wake them. His knees ached in a way that hadn't bothered him 6 months ago. He was 28 years old. The walk from Cherry Street to the Brooklyn Ferry took 40 minutes through streets still dark. Murphy carried his lunch pail, bread, cheese, an apple his daughter had polished on her sleeve, and walked beside men he knew only by their coughs and the particular rhythm of their boots on cobblestones. They didn't talk much in the mornings. Everyone was saving their breath for what came next. The East River looked black under a sky turning the colour of old pewter. Murphy paid his penny and stood at the rail as Manhattan receded. Across the water, 2 massive structures rose from the riverbed like the towers of some drowned cathedral surfacing at low tide. The Brooklyn Bridge, they called it, though bridge was too small a word for what it was becoming. Between those towers, invisible in the pre-dawn darkness, steel cables would soon hang like frozen lightning. But first, before anything could rise, men like Murphy had to go down. He descended into the Brooklyn Caisson at 6 o'clock exactly, following 15 other men down an iron shaft that smelled of rust and river water, and something else, something metallic and wrong that he'd learned not to think about. The shaft was narrow enough that his shoulders nearly touched both sides. Lanterns hung every 20 feet, their light turning orange then red as he went deeper. 30 feet, 40, 55 feet below the surface of the river, below the mud, below everything solid, there was a door. The airlock chamber was 8 feet square. The foreman, a Scotsman named Angus McCrae, counted heads and checked his watch. Murphy pressed his back against the iron wall and waited. Someone coughed. Someone else spat. Then McCrae opened the valve, and Murphy heard the hiss that meant the air was coming. The pressure changed everything. It started in your ears, a stabbing pain that made grown men cry out before they learned to work their jaws, to swallow, to equalize. But the ears were just the beginning. As the air compressed, your chest felt smaller. Your heartbeat changed rhythm. The lantern flames burned brighter and stranger. Men said the light looked different down here, cleaner somehow, like seeing through water. Murphy's head throbbed, his hands tingled. He tasted blood at the back of his throat. These sensations weren't new. After 4 months in the Caissons, he'd learned they were simply the price of descent. The inner door opened and they stepped into the working chamber. It was hell's own workshop. Imagine a wooden box 80 feet long and 102 feet wide, with a ceiling that pressed down at 9 feet tall. The walls dripped constantly, beaded with moisture that caught the lamplight. The floor was mud, not soil, but river mud, black and thick and mixed with things Murphy tried not to identify. Dead fish, fragments of old ships, occasionally human bones from some forgotten graveyard. The air itself felt thick enough to chew, heavy with moisture and heat and the breath of 30 men working side by side. They called it compressed air, but that made it sound clean. What it really was, the same air you'd breathe on the surface, but forced down, compressed into this chamber at 2 atmospheres of pressure to keep the river from flooding in through the open bottom. The East River pressed down on them through tons of mud, and only this thick air held it back. It was a miracle of engineering. It was also a trap. Murphy's job was simple in description, brutal in execution. He swung a pickaxe at the riverbed, breaking up clay and mud and rock so other men could shovel it into buckets that rose through the shaft. Hour after hour he swung, The work generated its own heat, and within 20 minutes, every man had stripped to his undershirt, despite the January cold that existed somewhere far above. Sweat poured down Murphy's face, stinging his eyes. His muscles screamed, but he kept swinging, because standing still meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering that he was buried alive under a river with nothing but compressed air between him and drowning. The sounds never stopped. Pickaxes striking stone, shovels scraping, men grunting, water dripping from everywhere. And underneath it all, a low hum that seemed to come from the air itself, the pressure singing in your bones. Sometimes, when the work paused, you could hear the river moving overhead, a deep groaning that reminded every man exactly where he was. Peter O'Donnell worked beside Murphy, a man of 40 with 4 arms like bridge cables, and 6 children waiting in a room in Brooklyn. O'Donnell had worked in the Caisson longer than almost anyone, 7 months, and men watched him the way sailors watch the oldest hand during a storm. If O'Donnell kept working, it was safe. If O'Donnell paused, everyone paid attention. Around 10 o'clock, O'Donnell stopped swinging. He stood still, pickaxe dangling from one hand, staring at nothing. Murphy watched him from the corner of his eye while continuing his own rhythm. O'Donnell's face had gone pale, visible even in the uncertain lamplight. Then O'Donnell bent double and vomited onto the mud. He stayed bent for 5 seconds, 10, then straightened slowly and went back to work without a word. No one commented. Men vomited down here, men got dizzy, got nosebleeds, got strange pains in their joints. You worked through it, or you went back up and lost your pay for the day. Most men worked through it. The shifts lasted 4 hours in the compressed air, though it felt like days. There was no natural light, no way to judge time except by the ache in your muscles and the foreman's pocket watch. Murphy had learned to count his own heartbeats, estimating minutes, but the counting made time slower. Better to lose yourself in the rhythm of the work, to let the pickaxe swing become automatic, to think about nothing but the next blow, the next, the next. At 10:30, something changed in the mud ahead. Murphy's pickaxe struck something that wasn't mud or clay. He crouched, wiping away the muck with his bare hands, and exposed a smooth stone surface. The foreman came over with a lantern. It was a cornerstone, carved and deliberate, part of some structure that had stood here before New York was New York, before this was anything but wilderness and water. They looked at it for a moment without speaking, this evidence of other men who had built something, other men who were now long dead. Then the foreman nodded, and Murphy swung his pickaxe harder to break the old stone into pieces small enough to haul away. The past was rubble. The present was this chamber, this pressure, this work. At 11 o'clock, the foreman blew his whistle. End of shift. The men gathered at the base of the shaft, mud-covered and exhausted, and waited for the airlock. This was the dangerous part, though none of them knew why. The ascent. They crowded into the chamber. 15 men pressed shoulder to shoulder, and McCrae sealed the door behind them. Then he opened the valve to reduce the pressure. Murphy felt it immediately. The tightness in his chest eased. His ears popped. The headache that had been building all morning suddenly sharpened into a spike of pain behind his left eye. He closed his eyes and waited. 2 minutes, McCrae always allowed. 2 minutes for the pressure to equalize. Then the outer door opened and they climbed up toward daylight. Murphy emerged into the January morning and stood blinking in light that felt impossibly bright. His legs trembled, his vision blurred at the edges. He walked carefully, aware that his balance was wrong, and made his way to the shore where men sat on piles of lumber and ate their lunches. He opened his pail and tried to eat. The bread tasted like metal. The cheese made his stomach lurch. He forced down half the apple and gave the rest to a gull that watched him with eyes that seemed more alert than his own. Around him, other men were experiencing their own private agonies. Thomas Burke, 19 years old, 3 weeks in the Caisson, sat with his head between his knees, breathing in shallow gasps. Patrick Doyle, a veteran of 5 months, walked in circles, shaking out his arms, trying to work, feeling back into hands that had gone numb. And Peter O'Donnell, the old hand, the one everyone watched, sat perfectly still with his lunch untouched and blood trickling from his left nostril. O'Donnell reached up, touched the blood, looked at his fingers. Then he wiped his hand on his trousers and went back to sitting still. No one commented. Blood happened down here. Nosebleeds, bleeding gums, blood in your urine that turned it dark as tea. The company doctor, when men complained, called it normal. The work was hard, he said. The air was compressed, he said. Blood vessels were delicate things. It would pass. What the doctor didn't say, what no one understood in January of 1872, was that compressed air forces nitrogen into your blood. Your body absorbs it the way a sponge absorbs water. And when you ascend too quickly, when the pressure drops too fast, that nitrogen comes out of solution. It forms bubbles in your bloodstream, in your tissues, in your joints and spine and brain. Tiny bubbles, microscopic, but enough to paralyze, to blind, to kill. The workers didn't have a name for it yet. Later, it would be called Caisson disease. Later still, the bends. But in 1872, it was just called bad luck, or weakness, or the price of honest work. Murphy went back down at noon for the second shift. 4 more hours. The descent was worse the second time. His ears wouldn't equalize properly, and the pain made his eyes water. In the caisson, the heat seemed more oppressive, the air thicker. He swung his pickaxe with mechanical precision, but his right shoulder had developed a strange ache, deep in the joint that sharpened with every blow. By 2 o'clock, Thomas Burke was on his knees in the mud. He'd been trying to stand, but his legs wouldn't hold him. 2 men helped him to the shaft, supporting his weight between them, and McCrae sent him up early. Burke was crying, Murphy noticed. Crying without sound, tears cutting channels through the mud on his face. He looked terrified. Murphy went back to work. The thing about the caissons was that every man knew the work was dangerous. You could be crushed by falling timber. You could be buried in a mudslide. The compressed air could fail and the river could flood in, drowning everyone in seconds. These were risks you could understand, risks you could watch for. But what was happening to the workers was different. It was invisible. It came from inside. And it was getting worse. Patrick Doyle finished the shift, but when he emerged at 4 o'clock, he couldn't climb the stairs from the ferry dock. His legs simply stopped working. He sat down hard on the bottom step, looking at his knees as if they belonged to someone else, and 3 men carried him to his lodging house. He never walked again. 23 years old, and for the rest of his life, another 42 years, he would drag himself from room to room using his arms, his useless legs trailing behind. The company doctor examined him, found no external injury, and declared it a nervous condition. No compensation was provided. Doyle's wife took in laundry. Murphy went home that night, moving like a man twice his age. His knees burned, his shoulder throbbed, his head pounded with every heartbeat. His wife took one look at him and helped him to bed without questions. She'd seen it before, all wives had. Men went down healthy and came up broken, piece by piece, day by day. But the work paid $3 for an 8-hour day. 4 hours down, 4 hours up, when other labor paid $2 for 12. You could feed a family on $3 a day. You could even save a little if you were careful. And so the men kept going down. In the morning, Murphy's daughter woke him with the same gentle touch. His joints had stiffened overnight, and it took him 5 minutes to stand. He walked to the ferry. He descended into the Caisson. He swung his pickaxe. This was January. By March, he would be dead. But first, you need to understand who built this trap, who designed the caissons, who drove the work, who watched the workers suffer and ordered them back down anyway. You need to understand Washington Augustus Roebling, because his story is inseparable from theirs, and his guilt would haunt him for the rest of his long life. Washington Roebling was the chief engineer of the Brooklyn Bridge, son of the visionary John Roebling, who had conceived the bridge but died before construction began, killed by tetanus from a ferryboat accident while surveying the site. Washington inherited his father's dream and his father's iron will. He was 32 years old when he took command of the project, a Civil War veteran who had served at Gettysburg and seen men die in quantities that perhaps inured him to suffering. Or perhaps it did the opposite. Perhaps it made him desperate to build something that wouldn't collapse, that wouldn't kill, that would stand for centuries as proof that men could create as well as destroy. The caissons were his design, based on European methods, but pushed deeper than anyone had attempted before. To build bridge towers in the middle of a river, you needed foundations that reached bedrock. To dig foundations in a river bottom, you needed to work underwater. The caisson was the solution, a massive wooden chamber sealed on top and open at the bottom, with compressed air pumped in to keep the water out. Men worked inside, excavating the riverbed while the caissons slowly sank under its own weight, and the weight of the stone masonry being built on top. It was brilliant. It was necessary. And Washington Roebling knew it was killing his workers. He descended regularly into the caissons himself, inspecting the work, taking measurements, staying down for hours at a time. He experienced the same symptoms, the headaches, the joint pain, the exhaustion. But he was the chief engineer. He couldn't show weakness. He couldn't admit that his design, his method, his bridge might be built on a foundation of broken men. In February 1872, the Brooklyn Caisson reached 55 feet below the surface, deeper than any caisson had gone in America, deeper than was wise, deeper than was safe. The pressure required to hold back the river at that depth was crushing. Men began collapsing daily. Some recovered after a day of rest. Others didn't. Peter O'Donnell, the old hand, the man everyone watched, stopped coming to work. Word filtered back that he was blind. Completely blind. He'd gone to bed one night with a headache and woken in darkness that wouldn't lift. The company doctor examined him and found nothing wrong with his eyes. The blindness came from somewhere else, somewhere inside, somewhere the doctor couldn't see. Murphy heard this news during the lunch break on a grey afternoon in late February. He sat on his usual pile of lumber and thought about O'Donnell walking in circles with his lunch bucket, shaking out his arms, teaching younger men how to work the lock. O'Donnell had 6 children. Murphy had 3. The arithmetic was simple and terrible. That afternoon, Murphy descended for what would be his last time, though he didn't know it yet. The work was the same. Swing, strike, the rhythm that had become as natural as breathing. Around 2:30, he paused to wipe the sweat from his face. His right arm had gone numb from the shoulder down. He flexed his fingers, trying to work sensation back into them, and saw something odd. His fingernails had turned blue. Not pale, not purple, but blue like ink, like the deepest water. He stared at them for a moment, confused, then went back to work. The arm would wake up. It always did. At 3 o'clock, Murphy felt something pop in his chest. Not painful exactly. Just a sensation of something giving way, like a cork being pulled. He stopped mid-swing and put his hand over his heart. His pulse was racing, irregular, jumping and stuttering. He could feel it in his throat, in his temples, a panicked rhythm that his body had chosen without his permission. He stood very still, waiting for it to normalize. Around him, men kept working, the sound of their labor a distant roar. Then his vision began to fail. Not darkness, he would have understood darkness. Instead, his field of view narrowed, as if he were looking through a tunnel that was slowly closing. He could see the mud directly in front of him, his own boots, the pickaxe at his feet. But the periphery had gone grey, then black, and the darkness was advancing. He opened his mouth to call for help, but his tongue wouldn't work properly. The sound that came out was slurred, unrecognizable. The foreman saw him fall. McCrae ran over, as much as a man could run in mud, under pressure in a space too low to stand upright, and grabbed Murphy's arm. Murphy's eyes were open, but they weren't focused. Blood ran from both his ears, bright red against the mud on his face. More blood seeped from the corners of his eyes. Not tears, but actual blood, leaking from vessels that had burst behind the eyeball. McCrae shouted for help, and 2 men dragged Murphy to the shaft. They got him into the airlock, but they made a mistake, born of panic and compassion. They wanted to get him to the surface quickly. They wanted to get him to a doctor, to fresh air, to help. So McCrae opened the decompression valve wider than usual. The pressure dropped fast, too fast, and the nitrogen in Murphy's blood expanded like 1,000 tiny explosions. In his brain, in his spine, in his joints and organs and the small capillaries of his lungs. John Murphy died in the airlock chamber, still 50 feet below the East River, while 3 men tried to understand what they were watching. He convulsed, he vomited blood. His eyes rolled back until only the whites showed, and those whites were marbled with red where vessels had hemorrhaged. He made a sound, not a scream, not a moan, but a wet rattling that came from his chest. And then he stopped. The whole thing took less than a minute. They brought his body up anyway because leaving him below was unthinkable. They laid him on the dock and sent someone running for the doctor, though everyone knew there was no point. Murphy was 28 years old. He left a wife and 3 children in a tenement on Cherry Street. The company provided $25 for burial expenses and hired another worker the next day. The doctor who examined Murphy's body wrote in his report, "Death from natural causes, exacerbated by hard labor in adverse conditions." He mentioned the blood from the ears and eyes, but attributed it to ruptured blood vessels from extreme exertion. He didn't mention decompression. He didn't mention nitrogen bubbles. He didn't mention that the bridge was killing men in ways that couldn't be fixed with better timber or stronger cable. Because in 1872, almost no one understood what was happening. But Washington Roebling was starting to suspect. He'd read the European papers, the reports from the French bridge engineers who had worked in compressed air and noticed similar symptoms. They called it la maladie des Caissons, Caisson disease. The French had theories. Maybe it was the foul air. Maybe it was carbon dioxide buildup. Maybe it was the rapid transition from pressure to normal atmosphere. One French physician suggested that ascending slowly might help, but his recommendations were vague, uncertain, and largely ignored. Roebling implemented what safeguards he could. He reduced shift times. He insisted on slower decompression. He installed better ventilation. But the bridge had a schedule, and the schedule was falling behind, and the investors were asking questions, and the workers needed the money, and so the work continued. Men kept descending. Men kept ascending, and men kept dying, or being paralyzed, or going blind, or developing strange agonies in their joints that lasted the rest of their lives. In March 1872, a German immigrant named Friedrich Schneider spent 4 hours in the Brooklyn Caisson and emerged complaining of severe pain in his knees and elbows. By evening, the pain had spread to his hips and shoulders. By midnight, he was screaming. His wife called for the doctor, who administered laudanum and watched helplessly as Schneider's joints swelled to twice their normal size. The man's knees looked like melons. His fingers were sausages. The doctor could do nothing. Schneider's screams could be heard 3 buildings away. After 2 days, the pain began to subside. After a week, Schneider could walk again, though with a permanent limp. After a month, he returned to work in the Caisson because he had no other means of supporting his family. He survived another 2 weeks before his heart gave out during decompression. He was 31 years old. The pattern was becoming clear to anyone willing to see it. The deeper the caisson went, the worse the symptoms became. The longer men stayed at depth, the more likely they were to be injured. The faster they ascended, the more severe the consequences. But the bridge required depth, needed to reach the bedrock that would support a structure designed to stand for centuries. And reaching that depth required men willing to go down. By April 1872, the Brooklyn Caisson had reached its final depth, 44 feet, 6 inches. Not the 55 feet Roebling had initially planned. He'd found adequate bedrock earlier than expected. Or perhaps he'd convinced himself it was adequate, but deep enough to have killed at least 20 men outright and disabled hundreds more. The exact count was never recorded. Workers who died at home days after their last shift weren't counted as bridge casualties. Workers who developed chronic pain or breathing problems or heart conditions were simply noted as having left the project. The official records would list 3 deaths from Caisson disease. The real number was perhaps 10 times that. And then it was Washington Roebling's turn. In May 1872, after months of regular descents into the caissons to inspect the work and take measurements, after pushing himself as hard as he pushed his workers, Roebling spent a full day in the Brooklyn Caisson, 6 hours at depth, taking detailed notes on the bedrock conditions. He emerged at 5 o'clock, went home to his wife, ate dinner, and collapsed. The paralysis started in his legs. By midnight, he couldn't move from the waist down. By morning, the paralysis had spread to his arms. He lay in bed, fully conscious, unable to move, watching his wife's face as she tried not to let him see her terror. The doctors came and went, offering no help, no diagnosis, no hope. They bled him. They applied poultices. They suggested rest. Roebling remained paralyzed for 3 days. Then, gradually, sensation began to return. First as tingling, then as burning pain, then as something approaching normal feeling. Within a week, he could move his fingers. Within 2 weeks, he could sit upright. Within a month, he could stand with assistance. But he was never the same. He developed chronic pain that would plague him for the rest of his life. His vision deteriorated. He became sensitive to noise and light. He suffered from severe headaches that would last for days. And he could never return to the caissons. His body couldn't tolerate the compressed air anymore. One more descent might kill him. And yet, the bridge wasn't finished. The Brooklyn Caisson had reached bedrock, but the New York Caisson, on the Manhattan side, was just beginning. It would need to go deeper, to 78 feet below the surface, because the bedrock on that side was lower. Deeper meant higher pressure. Higher pressure meant more casualties. Roebling knew this, and from his bedroom in Brooklyn, too ill to visit the site, he directed the work anyway. His wife, Emily Warren Roebling, became his proxy. She learned engineering from her husband's bedside, studied the plans, memorized the calculations, and carried his instructions to the site daily. She dealt with the workers, the contractors, the investors, translating her husband's vision into reality while he lay in a darkened room, too sick to bear sunlight, directing the construction of one of the world's great monuments by sheer force of will. The New York Caisson began its descent in the spring of 1872, and the pattern repeated with terrible precision. Men descended, men worked, men ascended, and men collapsed, or went blind, or became paralyzed, or developed the agonizing joint pain that workers had started calling the bends, because it forced them to bend double in pain. Frank Harris was 21 years old when he went down for the first time in June 1872. He was strong, healthy, optimistic in the way only the young can be when faced with danger they've never experienced. He needed the money, $3 a day when his previous job paid half that, and he needed it to marry a girl named Catherine who worked in a textile mill. They'd been engaged for 2 years, waiting until he had enough saved for a deposit on rooms. The Caisson work would get him there in 6 months instead of 2 years. It seemed like a gift. Harris lasted 4 weeks. He was careful. He listened to the veterans, learned to ascend slowly, learned to rest properly between shifts. He did everything right. But on a Wednesday afternoon in July, he finished his shift, ascended at the proper rate, emerged into the summer heat, and felt a sudden sharp pain in his lower back. Not the usual ache, something different, something wrong. He walked home slowly, pausing often, one hand pressed against his spine. By evening he couldn't feel his legs. By morning he couldn't control his bowels. The paralysis was permanent. The doctors offered no explanation and no hope. Catherine married him anyway, in a ceremony where he sat in a borrowed wheelchair and spent the next 43 years caring for a man who had once been able to lift her off her feet with one arm. They never had children. Harris developed bed sores that never healed. He died at 64 from an infection that started in one of those wounds. The last thing he said to Catherine was an apology. These stories multiplied through the summer and fall of 1872 as the New York Caisson descended deeper and deeper. At 60 feet, men began seeing things, hallucinations caused by nitrogen narcosis, though no one called it that yet. They saw faces in the mud. They heard voices. One worker became convinced that his dead brother was working beside him and had full conversations with empty air. At 70 feet, the hallucinations became more common. Men would pause mid-swing, staring at nothing, then suddenly laugh or cry or scream. The foreman learned to watch for the blank stare that preceded a break with reality. At 78 feet, the final depth of the New York Caisson, the compressed air pressure was so high that it changed the properties of matter itself. Candle flames burned with an intense white light. Sounds became sharper, more distinct. Even simple movements required extra effort because the air was so dense. And the human body, forced to operate in these conditions, began to fail in ways both predictable and bizarre. Men's teeth exploded. The pressure differential between the air inside the tooth and the compressed air outside would cause fillings to fail catastrophically, sometimes taking part of the jaw with them. Men developed bends in joints they didn't know they had. Bones in the feet, the hands, the spine. One worker complained of pain in his hip and spent the rest of his life with one leg, 3 inches shorter than the other, because the femur had partially collapsed under the pressure. Another developed such severe pain in his shoulders that he couldn't raise his arms above his waist. He'd been a carpenter before the Caissons. Afterward, he couldn't hold a hammer. The death toll mounted, though the exact number remained uncertain because the company didn't track it carefully, and workers who died at home weren't officially connected to their bridge employment. Best estimates suggest that somewhere between 100 and 120 men died from Caisson disease during the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. Hundreds more were permanently disabled, and thousands, every worker who spent time in the Caissons, suffered some level of long-term health effects. Washington Roebling watched all this from his sick room, directing the work through Emily, unable to visit the site, unable to descend into the Caissons, unable to do anything but order other men into the same trap that had broken him. He would live with that knowledge for the rest of his life, another 44 years, and the guilt carved itself into every letter he wrote, every decision he made, every time he looked at the bridge that bore his father's name and his own pain. In his private correspondence, never meant for publication, he wrote, "The bridge is a monument to human ambition and human suffering in equal measure. Every stone, every cable, every rivet represents not just iron and steel, but blood and bone. The workers who built it paid with their bodies, and I paid with my conscience." But publicly, the official position remained that Caisson disease was poorly understood, unpredictable, and not the fault of the engineering or the project management. The workers signed on willingly. They knew the risks. They were compensated above the going rate. If they developed health problems afterward, well, that was unfortunate but not the company's responsibility. This position would be echoed in industrial disasters for the next century. The workers accepted the risks. The company provided adequate pay. No one forced them to do the work. The truth was more complicated and more cruel. Most workers didn't understand the risks because no one understood the risks. The science of decompression sickness wouldn't be properly explained until 1908, when John Scott Haldane published his research on staged decompression. By then, the Brooklyn Bridge had been standing for 25 years, and the men who built it were mostly dead or dying from conditions their doctors couldn't explain. Francisco Silva understood none of this when he joined the Caisson crew in August 1872. He was Portuguese, spoke little English, and followed the work where it led. He'd done mining in California, logging in Oregon, and hard labor in a dozen cities. The Caisson work didn't seem worse than anything else he'd done. It paid better, anyway. Silva lasted 6 months, working steadily through the fall and winter as the New York Caisson settled into its final position. He was strong and careful. He had good instincts about when to rest and when to push. He might have survived the work intact if not for a single moment of bad luck in February 1873. The foreman sent him down for an extra shift. A worker had called in sick, and they needed to maintain the crew numbers. Silva descended for the second time that day, already tired, already carrying the nitrogen load from his morning shift. He worked for 3 hours without incident. But when he ascended, something went wrong in the airlock. The valve stuck open slightly and the pressure dropped faster than it should have. Not dramatically faster, just a few seconds quicker than normal. But those few seconds made the difference. Silva emerged onto the dock and took 3 steps before his spine turned to fire. The pain was so sudden and so total that he didn't scream. He simply fell, rigid, unable to bend or move or breathe properly. Men carried him to the medical tent where the company doctor examined him, found no external injury, and administered morphine. The pain lasted for 3 days before beginning to subside. Silva could walk again after a week, but he walked differently, his spine locked at a slight curve, his movements careful and pained. He went back to work because he needed the money. He lasted another month before the pain became unmanageable. He left New York, traveled south looking for work that wouldn't require heavy lifting, and died in Baltimore in 1876 from what the death certificate called chronic inflammation of unknown origin. He was 34 years old. Stories like Silvers, like Harris's, like Murphy's and Schneider's and hundreds of others, were common knowledge among the workers but rarely made it into newspapers. The Brooklyn Bridge was one of the great engineering projects of the age, a symbol of American ambition and technological prowess. Stories of broken workers didn't fit the narrative. When reporters toured the site, they wrote about the massive stone towers rising majestically from the river, the revolutionary steel cables, the visionary design. They mentioned the workers only in passing as part of the scenery, the human machinery that made the real machinery function. But the workers talked among themselves. They knew what the Caissons did to men. They knew the symptoms to watch for, the headaches, the joint pain, the numbness, the sudden paralysis. They developed their own folk remedies and preventive measures, most of which didn't work. Some men believed that drinking heavily after a shift would help flush the bad air from their systems. Others thought that staying warm prevented the bends. Some refused to sit down after ascending, believing that movement kept the blood flowing properly. None of these methods worked because none of them addressed the real problem, which was nitrogen bubbles forming in the bloodstream. The one thing that did help, though no one understood why, was ascending slowly. Workers who spent 10 or 15 minutes in the airlock chamber, letting the pressure reduce gradually, were less likely to develop severe symptoms. But slow decompression meant fewer shifts per day, which meant less work accomplished, which meant pressure from management to speed things up. The balance between safety and progress was decided in favor of progress, always, because bridges don't build themselves and workers can be replaced. By the spring of 1873, both caissons had reached their final depths and been filled with concrete, transforming them from working chambers into permanent foundations. The most dangerous phase of construction was over. The towers would continue rising, the cables would be spun, the roadway would be constructed, but all of that work would happen in open air, without compressed air, without the caissons. The men who had survived could move on to other work, carrying their damaged bodies and their memories with them. Thomas Kelly was one of those survivors. He'd worked in both caissons for 18 months total, and emerged with chronic joint pain, impaired vision, and a heart that would skip beats at random, sometimes for hours at a time. He was 33 years old and moved like a man of 60. He found work as a night watchman, a job that required little physical exertion, and lived another 42 years, dying in 1915 from what his doctor called heart failure, but what was really the accumulated damage of those 18 months under the river. Martin O'Brien survived with permanent numbness in both hands. He'd been a skilled carpenter before the caissons. Afterward, he couldn't feel wood grain or judge pressure or do any of the fine work that had been his livelihood. He became a stevedore, work that required strength but not dexterity, and supplemented his income by training pigeons, which he could handle because he could see what he was doing even if he couldn't feel it. His hands were essentially dead from the wrists forward, flesh-coloured gloves with no sensation. But he adapted. Samuel Chen, one of the few Chinese workers on the project, survived physically intact, but developed what would now be recognized as severe PTSD. He couldn't sleep in enclosed spaces afterward. He couldn't tolerate darkness. He'd wake from nightmares about drowning, about being trapped, about the river breaking through and flooding the Caisson. He left New York as soon as the work ended and never returned. His descendants would later discover letters he'd written describing the Caissons as the mouth of hell, describing the work as building a monument to dead men, describing his survival as luck rather than skill. And there were men who emerged seemingly healthy, who congratulated themselves on escaping the bends, only to develop symptoms years later. The nitrogen that had dissolved into their tissues during those hours under pressure sometimes stayed there, crystallizing slowly over years, creating chronic damage that manifested as arthritis or heart disease, or neurological problems that doctors couldn't trace to any obvious cause. These delayed casualties were never counted in any official tally, but they existed. Men who spent the last decades of their lives dealing with pain and disability from work they'd done decades earlier. The Brooklyn Bridge opened to the public on May 24, 1883, 11 years after Murphy descended for his last time. President Chester Arthur walked across it. Crowds cheered. Fireworks exploded over the East River. Emily Roebling was the first to cross, carrying a rooster as a symbol of victory. Washington Roebling watched from his window in Brooklyn, too ill to attend the ceremony, too damaged by his own design to walk across the bridge he'd built. The newspapers called it the eighth wonder of the world. They praised the engineering, the vision, the triumph of American ingenuity. They mentioned the workers briefly, noting that some men lost their lives in construction, but the details were vague. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle reported approximately 20 casualties during construction, which was accurate if you only counted men who died on site and ignored everyone who died at home, or later, or slowly from chronic conditions. No memorial was erected for the workers. No list of names was carved into stone. No ceremony honored the men who had descended into the Caissons and paid with their bodies for the bridge's existence. They were anonymous then, and remain largely anonymous now. Murphy, O'Donnell, Burke, Doyle, Harris, Schneider, Silver, Kelly, O'Brien, Chen, and hundreds of others, whose names weren't recorded because they were just workers, just labor, just the cost of doing something great. Washington Roebling lived until 1926, dying at 89 after a life spent in chronic pain and partial disability. He never fully recovered from his time in the Caissons. He never stopped feeling guilty about the men who had died under his command. In his later years, he would take visitors to his study and point to the bridge, visible from his window, and say, "Every cable, every stone, represents men who suffered." Then he would add quietly, "I was one of the lucky ones. I merely lost my health. Other men lost everything." The science of decompression wouldn't catch up to the casualties for another generation. John Scott Haldane's research in the early 1900s finally explained what had been happening in the caissons: the nitrogen absorption, the bubble formation, the need for staged decompression. His work led to the development of decompression tables, which specified exactly how long workers needed to spend at each pressure level to safely off-gas the nitrogen. These tables became standard for diving, tunneling, and any work in compressed air. But the knowledge came too late for the Brooklyn Bridge workers. By the time the science was understood, most of them were already dead. The survivors lived with their damage, uncompensated, often unable to work, carrying disabilities that no doctor could fully explain or treat. Some received small pensions from the company, token amounts that barely covered rent. Most received nothing. The Brooklyn Bridge still stands, exactly as Washington Roebling knew it would. The engineering was sound. The design was brilliant. The materials were adequate for the task. It has carried millions of people across the East River for more than a century, and will likely stand for centuries more. It is, by any measure, a triumph of human achievement. But stand at the entrance on the Brooklyn side, where the workers once descended into the Caissons, where Murphy walked on his last morning, where O'Donnell went blind, where Harris was paralyzed, where dozens of men died and hundreds more were broken, and ask yourself what this triumph cost. Ask yourself who paid for it. Ask yourself whether their names deserve to be remembered alongside the engineers and the politicians and the investors who took credit for the bridge's existence. The workers couldn't have explained the science that was killing them. They couldn't have described nitrogen narcosis or decompression sickness or barotrauma. But they knew in their bodies what the caissons did to men. They felt it in their joints, their heads, their failing vision. They watched friends collapse and never rise. They lived with the knowledge that each descent might be their last, that each ascent might leave them paralyzed or blind or dead. And they went down anyway, because they had children to feed and rent to pay, and because someone had to build the bridge. This is the story that doesn't get told in the triumphant narratives of American engineering. This is the foundation beneath the foundation, not bedrock, but bone. The Brooklyn Bridge is a monument to human ambition and human suffering, to what men can achieve and what they'll sacrifice to achieve it, to the distance between the engineers who design wonders and the workers who build them with their bodies. Murphy's daughter grew up without a father. O'Donnell's children grew up with a father who couldn't see them. Harris's wife grew old caring for a man whose body had betrayed him at 21. These are the human costs of progress, the real price of stone towers and steel cables, and a bridge that was supposed to connect two cities, but instead connected the living to the dead, the healthy to the broken, the remembered to the forgotten. Every time you cross the Brooklyn Bridge, by car, by train, on foot, you're traveling over the graves of men whose names you'll never know. You're walking on a foundation built from their suffering, mixed into the concrete like aggregate, permanent and invisible. They didn't die in a single dramatic disaster. They died slowly, quietly, one at a time or in pairs, from causes that seemed mysterious but were entirely preventable with knowledge that would arrive too late. This is industrial progress without the myth. This is what it means to build something that lasts for centuries when the lives doing the building last for seconds, relatively speaking. This is the true story of the Brooklyn Bridge, not just what was built, but who paid for it, and how they paid, and what they lost in the exchange. The bridge endures. The workers don't. That's the bargain we made, though the workers weren't consulted about the terms. Their contribution is acknowledged in the passive voice. Lives were lost. Sacrifices were made, as if these were natural disasters rather than predictable consequences of decisions made by men who knew better but chose profit and progress over safety and lives. Washington Roebling understood this. That's why he couldn't attend the opening ceremony. That's why he watched from his window instead of walking across the bridge himself. He knew what it had cost. He'd paid part of that cost personally, and he'd collected the rest from men who trusted him to know what he was doing, who believed that the chief engineer wouldn't send them anywhere he wouldn't go himself. Except he had sent them, again and again, long after he knew what it did to the human body, because stopping would mean admitting that the bridge couldn't be built, and the bridge had to be built. The city needed it. Progress demanded it. History required it. And so men descended into the Caissons, and some of them died there, and some of them died later, and some of them lived, but wished they hadn't. And the bridge was built on their broken bodies and stands there still. Beautiful and terrible. A connection across the river, and a monument to the men who provided the foundation no one talks about. Their blood seeped from their eyes, their joints filled with nitrogen bubbles, their spines crumpled under pressure differentials they couldn't see or understand. They worked in darkness under a river, in compressed air that felt like breathing water, in heat and mud and fear, swinging pickaxes at riverbeds so that stone towers could rise, so that steel cables could hang, so that generations of people who would never know their names could cross from Brooklyn to Manhattan in minutes instead of waiting for a ferry. That's the bridge. That's the truth of it. Not just steel and stone, but also suffering. Not just engineering and vision, but also exploitation and death. Both things are true simultaneously. The bridge is a marvel and a massacre, a triumph and a tragedy, a wonder and a warning about what we're willing to sacrifice in the name of progress. Every structure has a foundation. The Brooklyn Bridge's foundation is 55 feet down on the Brooklyn side, 78 feet down on the New York side, buried in bedrock and sealed in concrete, with the ghosts of the Caisson workers mixed in like rebar. They're still there, they'll always be there. And the next time you see that bridge, in person or in photographs or in films, remember that you're looking at their grave marker as much as you're looking at an architectural achievement. This is what they died for. This is what they bought with their lives. This is the price of beauty, of connection, of every permanent thing humans build. Someone, somewhere, paid for it with their body. And usually that someone was poor, and usually that someone was forgotten, and usually that someone's children went hungry anyway, despite the sacrifice. The Brooklyn Bridge stands as proof that we can build wonders. It also stands as proof that we build them on the backs of workers we're willing to break and then forget. Both truths exist in the same structure, inseparable, permanent. The bridge is both monument and crime scene, and it endures, beautiful against the sky, while the men who died building it, Murphy, O'Donnell, Harris, Schneider, Silver, and all the others, endure only in stories like this one, voices from beneath the river, asking to be remembered.